In January 2026, the United States seemed to be living in two eras simultaneously. Headlines spoke of economic growth, accessible artificial intelligence, and new digital opportunities. On the streets, however, the reality was much quieter. Coffee shops with "Help Wanted" signs that went unanswered, partially empty office buildings, and people working on their cell phones, sitting on park benches or in supermarket parking lots. Ethan Walker was part of that second world. At 32, he didn't look like someone on the verge of a financial turnaround. He lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, furnished with the bare essentials: an overly firm mattress, a folding table, and a chair that creaked whenever he leaned forward. What stood out most in the room wasn't an expensive computer or multiple screens, but a single cell phone, always charging, always in use. Ethan wasn't a tech genius. He didn't program, he didn't come from Silicon Valley, he didn't have investors or famous followers. His background was too ordinary to seem promising. He had worked as a clerk, a rideshare driver, and a temporary administrative assistant. Each attempt came with the promise of stability. Each termination came with the same generic explanation of restructuring. That morning, he sat on the building's outside steps, watching the sun slowly rise while scrolling through his phone. He wasn't looking for entertainment. He was analyzing patterns. In recent months, Ethan had noticed something curious. Ordinary people, with no technical background, were monetizing simple tasks with the help of artificial intelligence. Not flashy ads or miraculous promises, but small, scattered reports, forum comments, poorly edited videos, hastily deleted screenshots. Everything seemed fragmented, almost as if no one wanted to show the complete path. That was the first indication that something real was there. Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, Marcus Hale was observing the same phenomenon, but from a very different perspective. Marcus was a digital consultant in San Diego with a glass-fronted office, recurring contracts, and a strong social media presence. He spoke about the future of work with authority and confidence. He argued that artificial intelligence would democratize opportunities, but his courses and mentorship programs were expensive enough to filter out who would actually have access. Marcus didn't see the cell phone as the primary tool. For him, it was merely an entry point into sales funnels, platforms, and proprietary software. His vision was clear. AI was powerful, but it only generated real money when integrated into complex systems, preferably the ones he sold. When Marcus started noticing people monetizing their work using only a cell phone and free tools, he dismissed it as noise. Amateurism, something that would quickly disappear. Ethan, on the other hand, saw a sign there. The conflict didn't arise from a direct confrontation, but from a silent divergence of vision. While Marcus built authority by keeping knowledge fragmented, Ethan did the opposite. He tested, simplified, and documented everything. He would wake up early, choose a specific digital task, product descriptions, automated responses, content summaries, simple data organization, and try to execute it using only free AI and his cell phone. The first few days were frustrating. Confusing platforms, generic answers, repeated errors. Instead of giving up, Ethan changed his approach. He stopped trying to make money and started solving small, real, and immediate problems. Local businesses, independent creators, online sellers with little time and less technical knowledge. The money didn't come quickly, but the return was clear. A coffee shop needed help responding to online reviews. An e-commerce salesperson wanted better descriptions. A real estate agent needed to organize client messages. Ethan used AI to speed up the work, adapting everything via mobile phone and delivering simple solutions, charging little, but always delivering. The mystery began when he realized that no one seemed to talk openly about this path. popular content promised passive income, complex automations, and exaggerated gains. What Ethan was doing was the opposite: active, direct, almost invisible. And it worked. At the same time, Marcus began to notice a strange drop in his conversions. People interested in his courses were asking different questions. They wanted to know if it was possible to start just with a cell phone. They questioned whether they really needed so many paid tools. Something was changing off the radar. Ethan had no intention of challenging anyone. His focus was on surviving better, with less anxiety, using what he already had. Yet, without realizing it, he was heading towards territory that touched on bigger interests, the narrative that making money online had to be complicated, exclusive, and inaccessible. The lingering question was simple and unsettling. If it were truly possible to make money in 2026 using only AI and a cell phone, why were so few people teaching this clearly? And more importantly, what would happen if someone decided to show the complete method from scratch without any illusory shortcuts? Ethan didn't know it yet, but that question would change not only his routine, but also the balance of an entire market that profited from complexity. The United States of 2026 had no single face. In Phoenix, where Ethan lived, the contrast was stark. Entire neighborhoods depended on deliveries, apps, and fragmented digital jobs, while large corporations boasted record productivity thanks to automation. Artificial intelligence was no longer a novelty. It was invisible infrastructure like electricity or the internet. It was everywhere, but few knew how to use it to their advantage. Ethan began to spend more time around the city. Not for leisure, but for observation. Independent coffee shops, small real estate agencies, online stores run by a single person. He noticed a pattern. Everyone was overwhelmed with simple, repetitive and poorly resolved digital tasks. Answering messages, organizing information, writing basic texts, adapting content for social media. None of this required genius, just time and clarity. What was lacking wasn't money, it was infrastructure. Ethan began to understand that the true value of AI at that level lay not in creating something revolutionary, but in eliminate friction. He wasn't selling artificial intelligence. He was selling relief. He was selling recovered time. He was selling ready-made answers where before there was silence or delay. His method took shape without a formal plan. First, he would choose a single free AI tool accessible through his mobile browser. Then, he would define a specific type of problem. Nothing generic, something measurable. Responding to negative reviews, organizing message leads, rewriting confusing descriptions. The more specific, the better. Gradually, Ethan created an almost invisible routine. In the morning, he analyzed orders and messages. In the afternoon, he executed tasks quickly with the help of AI. At night, he delivered everything simply, without technical jargon. He didn't explain how he did it, he just showed the result. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale lived in a completely different environment. His San Diego office reflected the image he preached: minimalist, technological, and quiet. His clients were entrepreneurs seeking scale, automation, and accelerated growth. Marcus spoke of dashboards, integrations, and complex workflows as if they were absolute prerequisites. The problem was that the market was starting to change from the bottom up. Marcus had a small but efficient team: analysts, editors, and traffic managers, all well paid, all dependent on expensive systems. For him, the cell phone was just an accessory. He believed that those who started too small were nothing more than curious onlookers. This belief began to be tested when one of their clients cancelled a consulting appointment. The reason was simple: they had hired someone cheaper to handle specific tasks. Someone who delivered quickly, Someone who didn't require long contracts or complicated platforms. Marcus didn't know it, but this someone was part of the same ecosystem that Ethan was feeding. The digital world, at that time, was full of invisible workers, people who didn't appear in ads, didn't sell courses, and didn't promise financial freedom. They simply solved small problems and charged for it. Many used AI without deeply understanding how it worked. It was enough to know, ask the right question, edit better. Ethan started documenting everything, not as a content creator, but as someone trying to understand why it worked. He realized that AI didn't replace work. It compressed steps. The difference wasn't in the tool, but in the human capacity to contextualize, review, and deliver something useful. Some secondary characters began to take center stage in his routine. Lisa, the owner of a local flower shop, who couldn't respond to messages on time and was losing sales. Aaron, an online seller who had good products but confusing descriptions. Miguel, a rookie real estate agent, overwhelmed by messages from indecisive clients. They all had something in common. None of them wanted to learn technology. They wanted solutions. Ethan didn't see himself as a digital entrepreneur. He saw himself as an intermediary between chaos and clarity. AI was merely the accelerator, the cell phone, the point of contact. Culturally, the United States has always valued the idea of do-it-yourself, but now it was taking on a new meaning. It was no longer about building something from scratch, but rather orchestrate existing tools to generate immediate value. Ethan did this intuitively, while the market still insisted on romanticizing complex processes. Marcus, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of his own narrative. His content was still performing well, but the feedback had changed. More direct questions, less patience for long promises. People wanted to get started quickly, spend little and see results. He ignored the signs at first. He always ignored them. Delving deeper into that world made an inevitable clash clear. On one side, the digital elite selling systems. On the other, ordinary people using AI as a daily source of income. The battlefield wasn't technological, but narrative. Whoever controlled the story about how to make money online controlled the flow of attention and money. Ethan wasn't yet speaking publicly about what he was doing, but the method was taking shape, piece by piece. Simple enough to fit on a cell phone, powerful enough to unsettle those who profited from complexity. And without realizing it, he was approaching a point where remaining invisible would no longer be an option. The conflict began to intensify when the flow of orders ceased to be predictable. Until then, Ethan dealt with small, almost artisanal demands, one service here, another there. But in March 2026, something changed. The referrals began to link together. A satisfied customer commented to another, who commented to someone else. Without advertising, without active social media, the volume grew. And with it, new problems arose. Ethan quickly realized he couldn't accept everything. Some orders required more time than the price justified. Others involved unrealistic expectations, fueled by exaggerated promises circulating on the internet. For the first time, he needed to set clear boundaries, not for business strategy, but for survival. The cell phone, which once seemed sufficient for everything, began to become a bottleneck, not because of the technology, but because of the number of decisions it required. Which order to accept, how much to charge, how much time to dedicate. Each choice had a direct impact on that month's income. At the same time, external obstacles arose. Platforms began to quietly change the rules. Automated response algorithms started being penalized when misused. Clients began to ask if Ethan's work wasn't just the work of AI. Some were trying to reduce the value by disregarding the human effort behind the final result. Ethan quickly learned that the conflict wasn't just operational, it was perceptual. People confused tools with work. They thought pressing a button was enough. He started adjusting his delivery, showing versions, revisions, choices. He didn't explain the technical process, but he emphasized the care he took. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale was facing a different yet connected conflict. His business was still functioning, but it required increasingly more effort to maintain the same level of results. Campaigns needed frequent adjustments. Sales arguments had to be refined. The public was more skeptical, less impressionable. In internal meetings, uncomfortable discussions arose. One analyst commented that people were monetizing simple services with AI, charging little but delivering quickly. Another mentioned that some clients were skipping steps and no longer wanted to learn complex systems. Marcus reacted firmly. He said that this was not sustainable, that the market always corrected simplistic solutions, that those who didn't create structure ended up disappearing. But deep down, he could feel the friction. The central conflict began to take shape when Ethan decided to test something new, standardizing a service. Instead of solving any problem, he chose just one: organizing and responding to business messages. He created a simple, repeatable process that could be executed almost entirely via mobile phone. This brought efficiency, but also visibility. Some clients started asking if he trained other people. Others wanted to know if there was a model behind it. For the first time, Ethan realized he wasn't just providing services, he was accumulating replicable knowledge. This was the moment when internal tensions arose. Part of him wanted to keep everything small and controllable. Another part saw it as a chance for real stability, not instant wealth, but predictability. The obstacles multiplied when a larger client entered the scene. A small regional chain of stores that needed standardized, fast and human responses. The volume was high. The deadline was short. The payment was tempting. Ethan almost refused. Accepting meant stepping outside his comfort zone. It meant testing the limits of the method. It meant proving to himself that this wasn't just luck. He accepted. The execution revealed flaws, poorly categorized messages, responses that needed fine-tuning. The AI sped up but didn't make decisions. Ethan spent nights reviewing, correcting and adjusting prompts. Each mistake was a direct learning experience. Each success reinforced the logic of the method. On the other side, Marcus began to react. Without naming names, he began publicly criticizing promises of easy money with AI. He warned of risks, the trivialization of the market, and a decline in quality. His content took on a defensive tone. Less visionary, more protective. The conflict wasn't direct, but it was clear. Two opposing views on how AI should be used to generate income. Secondary characters began to influence the course of the story. Lisa recommended Ethan to other merchants. Miguel asked for help in structuring something similar. Some failed by trying to copy without understanding. Others succeeded in adapting. This brought a new layer of tension. The method worked, but it wasn't automatic. It required discernment, responsibility, and ethics, and the more it spread, the greater the risk of its misuse. The unfolding conflict made it clear that the central question was not whether it was possible to make money with AI and cell phones, but who would control the narrative about this. It's a question of whether it would be something accessible and practical, or just another inflated and disposable promise. Ethan didn't have all the answers yet. Marcus hadn't lost control yet. But they were already on a collision course, not because of vanity, but because of incompatible visions of the future. The market was changing, and there was no longer room for neutrality. As Ethan's method solidified, new layers began to emerge around the main story. Nothing happened in isolation. Each small advance brought consequences he hadn't foreseen when everything boiled down to answering messages on his cell phone. The first subplot took shape through the people who tried to replicate what he did. Miguel was one of the first. Excited by the initial results, he tried applying the logic to other brokers in the region. It worked partially. Some saw quick gains, Others were frustrated to realize that the AI didn't think for itself. It lacked criteria, adaptation, and context. The method wasn't a magic button, it was a process. These failures began to generate noise. People said it didn't work, without admitting they had skipped steps. Ethan realized that the simplicity of the method hid an invisible complexity, knowing how to decide what to ask the AI for and what to correct afterwards. Another subplot developed in the emotional realm. Despite the increased income, Ethan still lived with insecurity, not just financial, but structural. He had no fixed contract nor long-term guarantees. Each satisfied client was a victory, each late payment a reminder of his fragility. This led him to create a new habit, recording everything, conversations, deliveries, adjustments, not out of paranoia, but for protection. This extra care began to consume his time, and time was precisely the resource he was selling to others. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale was grappling with his own internal complexities. His team realized something was amiss. The authoritative narrative was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. In strategic meetings, proposals emerged for product simplification, more affordable versions, and mobile offerings. Marcus resisted. For him, oversimplifying meant losing control. His model depended on a perception of depth, on something that required continuous monitoring. Even so, the pressure was mounting. The market wanted speed. They wanted to start small. They wanted to test without commitment. This tension reflected a larger conflict within the American digital ecosystem, the breakdown of the learn everything before you earn something logic. AI was reversing this order. Now people earned something first and learned later. Another important subplot emerged when a freelance platform changed its terms. Services that seemed too automated began to be monitored. Accounts were suspended, deliveries were refused. Ethan, who worked in a hybrid model, realized the immediate risk. He needed to adapt his communication. He began to make it clear that his work was not pure automation, but human curation with AI support. He adjusted descriptions, changed words, redefined boundaries. This brought more security but also more responsibility. The time pressure began to intensify. Some clients wanted everything yesterday. The implicit promise of AI created unrealistic expectations. Ethan began setting strict deadlines. Those who didn't accept them, he refused. Each refusal hurt in the short term, but strengthened the method in the long term. The subplots intertwined when Lisa, the owner of the flower shop, suggested something simple. "Why don't you teach this?" The idea seemed too obvious to have been ignored before, but teaching meant putting oneself out there. It meant taking responsibility for the success or failure of other people. Ethan hesitated. Teaching would change everything. It would transform a silent method into a public narrative. It would attract attention. It would create allies and critics. At the same time, it could solve its biggest problem: predictability. Almost simultaneously, Marcus began noticing small, scattered pieces of content talking about AI on mobile phones. Nothing structured, nothing dominant, but enough to indicate an organic movement. This led him to accelerate launches and reinforce exclusivity narratives. The field was getting crowded. The complexities became clear. It wasn't just about making money with AI, but about when, and who would lead the story. Each subplot added weight to the main conflict. People failing to copy, platforms reacting, distorted expectations, authorities defending themselves. And above all, time was pressing. AI was evolving rapidly. What worked today could become commonplace tomorrow. Ethan felt there was a short window of opportunity, not to get rich, but to build something sustainable before the market was flooded with empty promises. All the subplots pointed to the same central theme. The method needed to mature, or it would be swallowed up by its own misinterpreted success. And the next step would require a decision that could not be undone. The turning point didn't happen at a large public event, nor in a direct argument between Ethan and Marcus. It emerged quietly, almost casually, on an ordinary Tuesday night when Ethan received an unexpected message. It was from a long-time client, someone who had started small, paying little, asking for simple adjustments. Now this person wanted something different, not a service, but the process. I wanted to understand exactly how Ethan managed to deliver so much, so quickly, using only his cell phone. Ethan read the message more than once. Until then, he had always avoided over-explaining. He delivered results, not methods, but that question made clear something he had been ignoring. The real value was no longer just in the service, but in the way to him. That same week, another sign appeared. A short video, posted by someone Ethan didn't know, described a simple way to make money with AI on your cell phone. The content was shallow, poorly explained, but it had already accumulated thousands of views. In the comments, confusion, frustration, and unrealistic expectations mingled that raised a red flag. If the method were misinterpreted, distorted, or exploited irresponsibly, it would lose credibility before it even became truly known. The narrative was spiraling out of control, and Ethan hadn't even entered the scene yet. The decision matured quickly. Instead of remaining invisible, Ethan did something he had never done before. He opened a document and wrote everything down. Not as a promise, nor as a course. He wrote it like a map. Free tools, types of real tasks, selection criteria, common mistakes, clear boundaries, what made money and what didn't. It was too simple to seem revolutionary, and that's precisely why it was powerful. The definitive turning point came when he transformed that material into short, direct, and honest public content. No elaborate editing, no exaggerated emotional triggers. Just a video recorded with his own cell phone, explaining a central idea. AI is not automatic income. It's a lever for simple work. If you solve real problems, people pay you. The impact was immediate and unexpected. There was no instant viral explosion, but there was something more dangerous for the traditional market. Identification. Ordinary people saw themselves reflected there. They commented that they finally understood where to begin. Others said they were already doing something similar, but had never organized the process. Marcus Hale watched the video by chance after it was sent by a team member. He recognized the risk immediately, not because of its reach, but because of its clarity. In just a few minutes, it dismantled the idea that an entire ecosystem was needed to generate online income. It didn't attack anyone directly. It simply showed an alternative path, accessible, practical, and difficult to refute. Marcus reacted quickly. He decided to take a stand. He published content criticizing the trivialization of artificial intelligence. He spoke about responsibility, professionalism, and the illusion of easy solutions. But something was different. For the first time, his speech sounded defensive, not inspiring. Meanwhile, Ethan was dealing with the consequences of his own move. Messages started arriving, people asking for guidance, others wanting him to confirm if it worked. Some demanded guarantees. Ethan realized that the turning point brought a new kind of pressure, involuntary authority. He needed to react quickly and decisively. Instead of promising results, he began to emphasize effort, criteria, and adaptation. He made it clear that the method wasn't for everyone, that it didn't replace work, that it didn't function without discipline. This stance deterred opportunists, but strengthened those who were truly willing to apply it. The unexpected event that solidified the turning point came shortly after. A content platform highlighted the video as an example of the practical use of AI in everyday life, not as a financial promise, but as a real-world case. This legitimized the method without turning it into a spectacle. Marcus understood, at that moment, that the game had changed. The control was no longer in the complexity, but in the usefulness, not in the promise, but in the application. And the public was beginning to realize this. For Ethan, the turning point was both internal and external. Internally, he stopped seeing himself merely as someone getting by. Externally, he began to be seen as someone who showed a possible path, not a glamorous one, but a real one. Nothing was resolved. On the contrary, the conflict had intensified. But one thing was clear. After that moment, there was no going back to anonymity. The method had a name, a form, and a direction. And now it needed to survive its own impact. The consequences of the turning point didn't come all at once. They spread like short, successive waves, each demanding a different reaction from Ethan. What had once been a personal method was now beginning to interfere with other people's rhythms, and that changed everything. In the first few days after publishing the content, Ethan noticed a clear change in the type of messages he received. Before, the requests were straightforward. How much does it cost? When will you deliver? Now they were loaded with expectation. People wanted emotional confirmation. They wanted to know if it really worked for someone like them. This change forced Ethan to adjust his posture. He started responding less and filtering more. He created standard responses, not automatic but strategic, making it clear that there were no shortcuts. Some distanced themselves immediately, others persisted. This natural filtering reduced the volume, but increased the quality of interactions. In the short term, this meant less money coming in. In the medium term, it meant stability. The reactions from past clients were also revealing. Some felt proud to have participated earlier. Others felt insecure, fearing that the method would become too common and lose value. Ethan had to reassure them, showing that the difference lay not in the tool, but in continuous execution. Meanwhile, small communities began to form informally. People exchanged experiences, mistakes, and adjustments. There was no official leader, but Ethan's name frequently came up as an initial reference. He observed everything cautiously. He knew that any poorly chosen word could become a promise taken out of context. On Marcus Hale's side, the consequences were more subtle and more profound. The metrics didn't plummet, but they stagnated. Campaigns that previously performed well now required more investment to generate the same return. In strategic meetings, the team talked about speech fatigue. The audience seemed tired of grandiose narratives. Marcus reacted by reinforcing his authority. More long-form content, more technical explanations, more intellectual differentiation. But this created a paradox. The more he delved into the subject, the further he distanced himself from the new audience that was emerging. External reactions began to put pressure on internal decisions. Some of Marcus's clients requested simpler versions of his services. Others asked if it was possible to start with just a mobile phone. These questions, which would have been dismissed before, now demanded answers. Ignoring them meant losing ground. The market as a whole reacted ambiguously. Platforms watched closely. Content creators tried to adapt the narrative. Some exaggerated, others copied without understanding. This generated a wave of misinformation that threatened to delegitimize the method. Ethan felt the impact directly when people started complaining that it didn't work, even without having followed basic criteria. He realized that the consequences of the tipping point demanded something new, clear delimitation. He started talking more about do not promise quick profits, do not automate without review, do not accept just any client, do not depend on a single platform. These negativity, paradoxically, strengthened the method. Internally, Ethan had also changed. The initial anxiety gave way to constant vigilance. Every decision now carried narrative weight. Accepting the wrong request could set a negative example. Refusing a partnership could close doors. He learned to act more slowly, even with external pressure for speed. Emotional reactions were inevitable. There were days of enthusiasm, when I saw someone receive their first payment using the method, and there were days of frustration when I realized that the simplicity attracted those seeking ease, not responsibility. The tipping point had generated movement, and all movement generates friction. Marcus, observing this scenario, began to reconsider his position, not publicly, but internally. He realized that fighting the idea was ineffective. Perhaps it was necessary to absorb it, reinterpret it, reposition it within its own ecosystem. This realization marked the beginning of a strategic shift, albeit a silent one. The ultimate consequences of that moment made it clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The market had been exposed to an uncomfortable truth. It was possible to start small, simple, and practical. This didn't invalidate complex models, but it called them into question. And for Ethan, the biggest consequence was the simplest and most burdensome. He now bore responsibility for an idea that was no longer solely his. The next step would require more than just reaction. It would require real growth. The growth that Ethan imposed upon himself was neither comfortable nor glamorous. It didn't come with constant euphoria or a feeling of ultimate victory. It came as an accumulation of difficult decisions, small sacrifices, and continuous adjustments that demanded maturity, not just technical, but personal. The first major challenge was saying no. Until then, Ethan had accepted almost anything that seemed reasonable. Now, that had become impossible. People wanted direct access, immediate answers, constant validation. If he gave in, he would return to the initial chaos, only amplified. So he began to establish strict criteria: type of task, clear expectations, realistic deadline. Those who didn't accept were left out. This change reduced the volume, but strengthened the method. At the same time, Ethan realized he needed to evolve his own way of working. His cell phone remained the center of everything, but now he used it more strategically. He created fixed routines, defined schedules, and clear boundaries. Work stopped invading every hour of the day. The turning point came when he realized that freedom wasn't about doing everything all the time. It was to choose consciously. Another challenge arose when some tried to transform the method into something it never promised. People added unnecessary layers, sold distorted versions, and mixed it with unrealistic promises. This threatened the credibility of what had been built. Instead of engaging in direct confrontation, Ethan did something more difficult, further refined simplicity. He began to show real-world examples, clear boundaries, and common mistakes. He didn't argue with exaggeration. He presented contrasts. This quiet approach ended up working better than any attack. Growth was also evident in how he viewed AI. Initially, it was a survival tool. Now it had become an operational partner. Ethan began testing more rigorously, better understanding the limitations and recognizing error patterns, not to master the technology, but to use it responsibly. This maturation was reflected in the results of the people who correctly applied the method. Small, consistent gains began to appear. Nothing spectacular, but real. Payments received, bills paid, reduced anxiety. Each of these accounts reinforced something important. The method worked when treated as work, not as a promise. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale was also undergoing a growth process, albeit a reluctant one. He realized that resisting change only increased the distance between his narrative and the reality of the market. Gradually, he began to adjust his discourse. He didn't abandon his complex systems, but he started to recognize simpler entry points, not as a concession, but as a strategic adaptation. This movement revealed something interesting. Growth did not require destroying the old, but reposition the new. For Ethan, the most significant growth was internal. He stopped seeing himself as someone improvising and began to recognize himself as someone who built a replicable, ethical, and sustainable process. Not perfect, but functional. The final breakthrough at this stage came when he achieved something that previously seemed impossible: predictability. Not absolute financial predictability, but predictability of pace. He knew how much he could deliver, how much he needed to earn, and how much he could refuse. This clarity changed everything. The method, now more mature, no longer depended on urgency. It depended on consistency, and that made it more resilient to the rapid changes in the market. By the end of this phase, Ethan was no longer just someone who used AI to make money with his cell phone. He was someone who had learned to grow without losing control, to evolve without inflating promises, and to move forward without repeating mistakes already overcome. But true growth always brings a new challenge, putting everything to the test, and what came next would leave no room for hesitation. The build-up to the climax didn't come as a clear announcement that something big was about to happen. It manifested as a steady acceleration, almost imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore as the weeks went by. Everything began to demand more precision, more responsibility, and less room for error. Ethan felt it in his body even before he could rationalize it. Decisions needed to be made faster. The consequences appeared sooner. There was no more room for careless experimentation. The method had moved from the discovery phase to the public validation phase. The subplots began to wrap up naturally. Miguel, after several failed attempts, finally found a format that worked for him. Specific support for small service providers. It wasn't scalable, but it was stable. Lisa, the owner of the flower shop, stopped relying on external help for basic messages and started using AI as daily support. Others simply gave up, and that was also part of the process. These resolutions reduced the noise surrounding the method. It became clear who was willing to treat it as work and who was just looking for a shortcut. Ethan used this moment to organize everything into a definitive format, not a traditional course, nor a promise of quick transformation. It was a practical guide. It was structured to be applied directly from a mobile phone. Each step had a clear purpose. Each task existed to solve a real problem. Nothing there was new in terms of technology. The difference lay in the sequence, the clarity, and the limits. Tension was growing because the external environment was also accelerating. Platforms were announcing new AI integrations. Content creators were vying for attention with increasingly exaggerated promises. The market was beginning to become saturated with rhetoric. This created a short window of opportunity. Either the method would become established as reliable, or it would be swallowed up by trivialization. Marcus Hale was watching everything with heightened attention. He had adjusted his positioning, but now faced a major strategic decision: to fully embrace the narrative of simplicity or to reaffirm complexity as a differentiating factor. Both choices carried risks. The first diluted his traditional authority. The second alienated him from a growing audience. The build-up to the climax intensified when Ethan received an unexpected invitation to participate in a public discussion about digital work and applied AI. Not as a technical expert, but as a real-world case study. This would put his method under open scrutiny. Accepting meant validating everything in the eyes of critics and curious onlookers. Refusing meant losing the chance to establish the correct narrative. Ethan accepted. From that moment on, everything began to converge. He revised each step of the method, not to make it more impressive, but to ensure its honesty. He cut what seemed inflated. He reinforced what required effort. He adjusted examples to avoid creating false expectations. The narrative tension grew because the final confrontation would not be personal, but ideological. On one hand, there was the idea that making money online had to be complex, technical, and exclusive. On the other, there was the proposition that solving simple problems with accessible tools was enough to get started. Ethan knew that the climax would not be in proving he was right, but in showing that the method survived real-world use without makeup. In the days leading up to the event, the messages increased, people wanting to know if now was the time, others asking for confirmation. He maintained his stance. There was no right time. There was decision and execution. The final preparation happened when Ethan did something symbolic. He turned down a large project that would pay well, but completely deviated from the method. That sealed his choice. He was no longer testing possibilities. He was defending a structure. Marcus, for his part, was preparing his own response. More measured content, less attack, more repositioning. He knew that this public debate could redefine the field. Everything was ready. The subplots were resolved. The tensions were clear. The positions were defined. The pace had accelerated to its maximum without exploding. The next step would not allow for subtle adjustments. The climax was approaching, and it wouldn't be silent. The climax didn't happen on a grand stage or in front of a physical crowd. It happened in a simple broadcast, watched by thousands of ordinary people, each with different and often conflicting expectations. It was there that two visions of making money online in 2026 would finally clash. Ethan entered the discussion without a prepared script, not because he was unprepared, but because he knew that any rehearsed speech would sound false in the face of the proposal he was defending. He wasn't there to impress. He was there to demonstrate consistency. Marcus Hale participated in the same debate. His presence lent weight to the event. He spoke with confidence, technical expertise, and refined vocabulary. He represented years of market experience, established structure, and consolidated authority. The contrast between the two was evident from the start. Tensions rose when the conversation shifted from the abstract to the concrete. Ethan was asked how someone with no experience could start making money using only AI and a cell phone. Instead of responding with concepts, he described a real-life situation, a specific task, a common problem, a simple execution and delivery process. Nothing glamorous, nothing automatic. The impact was immediate. Some viewers were frustrated. It wasn't the shortcut they were expecting. Others, however, reacted differently. They recognized the logic. It was something they could imagine doing the next day. Marcus responded cautiously. He partially agreed, but highlighted the risks, limitations, and the importance of a long-term vision. His argument was sound, but distant. He spoke of future structures while the audience wanted present-day solutions. The climax intensified when the inevitable question arose, "Won't this get old quickly?" Ethan did not deviate. He replied that yes, some things become saturated. They always have been, but real problems don't disappear, they just change form. And those who learn to solve simple problems learn to adapt to new ones. AI didn't eliminate work, it demanded it, more responsibility, no less. This response marked the emotional turning point of the climax. There were no excessive applause, but there was attentive silence. People began to realize that it wasn't a matter of choosing between simplicity or complexity, but between start or postpone indefinitely. The plausible turnaround occurred when Marcus, pressured by the logic presented, did something unexpected. He publicly acknowledged that many of his own clients could have started more simply, and that perhaps the market had erred in making everything inaccessible from the outset. It wasn't an apology, it was a strategic acknowledgement. Still, it changed the tone of the conversation. The central conflict was resolved there, not with an absolute victory, but with a shift in narrative power. The idea that it was possible to make money online starting small with AI and mobile phones ceased to be marginal. It became legitimate. Ethan's transformation became visible at that moment. He no longer spoke like someone trying to prove something. He spoke like someone who had tested, adjusted, failed, and refined. His posture was neither defensive nor aggressive. It was stable, coherent, sustainable. The climax ended without an explicit winner, but with a clear shift in collective perception. The audience left with fewer illusions and more clarity. That, in itself, was revolutionary. For Ethan, the final climax was internal. He realized he didn't need to convince everyone. He only needed to maintain the integrity of the method. From then on, those seeking shortcuts would follow another path. Those who wanted to build something real would have a foundation. Marcus also emerged transformed. Not defeated, but repositioned. The market had spoken, and he knew how to listen when necessary. The central conflict was resolved. It was no longer about whether it was possible to make money with AI and cell phones, but with what expectation and with what responsibility. The climax didn't end the story, but it definitively redefined the game. After the climax, there was no explosion of fame, nor an immediate shift to a completely different life. What followed was something rarer and harder to sustain: conscious stability. The story wasn't resolved in a single moment, but through a sequence of consequences that extended over the following months. Ethan returned to his routine, but not the same routine. The cell phone remained his primary tool, but now he used it with a clear sense of purpose. The method was defined, tested, and delimited. It wasn't growing chaotically. It was growing in a controlled, almost organic way. People arrived with more realistic expectations because the narrative had changed. The requests became more specific. Fewer vague questions, more concrete problems. This reduced friction and increased efficiency. Ethan no longer needed to explain so much. The method itself filtered out those who were truly willing to apply it. Financially, the gains weren't absurd, but they were consistent. For the first time in years, he was able to plan, pay bills in advance, refuse jobs that didn't make sense, invest time in improving the process, not just in surviving. The long-term consequences began to appear in the other characters as well. Miguel stabilized his income by serving a specific niche. He never got rich, but he broke free from the cycle of constant urgency. Lisa began to focus on growing her own business, using AI as daily support, not as a magic solution. Other people followed different paths. Some persisted, others gave up, and that was a natural part of the process. The digital market as a whole absorbed the impact. Exaggerated claims began to lose traction. They didn't disappear, but they faced more skepticism. The idea of making money with AI ceased to be a vague promise and began to be associated, at least in part, with applied work and solving real problems. Marcus Hale also found a new balance. He didn't abandon his complex systems or his position of authority, but he began to publicly acknowledge simpler entry points. His services became more segmented. Some clients started small and grew later. Others went straight to larger structures. The repositioning wasn't immediate, but it was strategic. The most important thing is that the conflict didn't leave clear winners and losers. It left learnings. The dominant narrative has shifted from discover the secret to learn how to execute, from automate everything to make better decisions, from passive income to earned income. This hasn't made the market easier, it's made it more honest. For Ethan, the conclusion was silent but profound. He realized that the true value of the method wasn't in the tool, nor the cell phone, nor even the AI. It was in the change of attitude. In accepting that making money online was no different from any other job, it required clarity, consistency, and responsibility. The method worked because it respected limits, because it didn't promise what it couldn't deliver, because it put the human being at the center, using technology as support, not as an excuse. The world of history hadn't completely transformed. There were still exaggerations, empty promises, and dubious shortcuts. But now there was also a visible, simple, and replicable alternative. Ethan didn't become a guru. He didn't build an empire. He didn't need to. He built something even harder to copy: practical credibility. The conclusion made it clear that in 2026, making money online with AI and a cell phone was neither a myth nor a miracle. It was a concrete possibility for those willing to treat simplicity as a strategy, not as laziness. And that understanding in itself was already a lasting transformation. Months later, Ethan was still using the same cell phone. The screen had small marks of use. The battery didn't last as long as before. But none of that mattered. What had changed wasn't the device itself, but how it was used. People continued to discover the method, adapting, making mistakes, correcting them. Some moved forward, others fell by the wayside. And that was okay. AI continued to evolve, the market continued to change, but one idea remained solid. Starting simple wasn't a limitation. It was an advantage. The future didn't belong to those who promised the most, but to those who knew how to apply it best. If this story has made you see artificial intelligence in a different light, the next step is yours. Not to look for shortcuts, but to observe real problems around you and test simple solutions. The method presented here is not a secret. It's a change in attitude. If you want to learn how to apply this in the real world, adapt it to your reality, and follow true stories of those starting from scratch, keep following the channel. Share your reflections, questions, and experiences in the comments. The future of work is being built now, and you can be a part of it.